Okay, we've got another question today. This is from my Dear Parents chat. So if you go to dearparents.substack.com, you can find a chat window where it has my Ask Me Anything. This is from a mom named Angie, and she says, my 9-year-old daughter shows signs of inattentive ADHD at home and some, but not enough at school and activities. She looks to peers to help with following two-step instructions, doesn't always hear the first part when someone says something. School says she doesn't qualify for educational testing because of her scores. She does receive support for math, and there are some holes in her learning. Did an outside speech assessment to look at things that would point towards dyslexia, and she scored great on that. We have pictures, lists, and use timers at home, but feel like these strategies are only helping a little bit. What would be your suggestions for the next steps? So this is a great question, and it is extremely common, especially in girls, that they are missed when it comes to executive functioning challenges, emotional regulation challenges, all those different things, because they can hold it together at school. They're smart. They wrench through, they just like work through it. They use all sorts of accessory muscles when it comes to all the different things that they do to stay on task, figure out what's going on, and they're bright enough that they don't flag attention. We all know those ADHD kids that are hyperactive, that are blurting out answers, that are moving around the classroom, like they get flagged, but these inattentive, especially girls, often get missed simply because they don't rise to the occasion of causing enough of a ruckus that someone says, hey, can you get them looked at? That does not mean that they don't often struggle. The reasons that they struggle, one is because they have a lot of trouble keeping attention, and it requires a lot of work to stay on task, to know what everyone is doing. They're using tons of context clues when their mind has wandered or they're distracted or they're overwhelmed. They're using lots of context clues to put that all together. And I honestly think that that's part of the reason that we're seeing such a upsurge in late diagnoses of ADHD is people are finally realizing, oh, I've been doing this all my life, and this has been really hard, and maybe there was a different way, and maybe things could have gone better. Now, there's a couple of different points that I like to make when I get to talk with parents about this. One is that they often are told by well-meaning clinicians they don't meet the diagnostic criteria for ADHD because you have to have interference in two different spheres. Now, they're not flagging at school because they're able to hold it together. They're smart. They don't cause a ruckus. Their grades are okay. But they're having a lot of difficulty at home. And that doesn't mean it's not interfering, because it's much harder than it could be. And one of the analogies that I typically turn to when it comes to ADHD in general is the analogy of asthma. If I have asthma, it's harder for me to breathe. And yes, maybe I can run quickly and, keep up with my peers, but I'm working harder to breathe. It's requiring a lot more of me. It's wearing me down more because I don't have properly managed asthma. And maybe people will say things like, hey, just breathe harder or take some deep breaths, or are you okay? Is everything okay? It seems like this race or this, downhill skiing or whatever it might have been really difficult for you breathing wise. Okay, take some deep breaths and move along. That doesn't mean that it's not harder, and it doesn't wear them down more than it should, simply because they don't have a lot of outward signs of interference. And so that's always something. When it comes to the diagnostic statistical manual, yes, that's great for research. And yes, research-wise, we want really fine diagnoses when we're talking about big things at the population level. But when we're talking about a child that is really struggling to hold it all together, I am very comfortable abandoning those DSM criteria if we have signs that they're struggling at school, if we have signs that they're struggling at home, that's maybe not meeting criteria simply because they are really good at holding it all together. And so I have had multiple patients that have come to me, especially in these exact circumstances of like a preteen girl who's been holding it all together but is really unraveling at home, that has a lot of anxiety, a lot of other things going on. It's because they're working so hard to hold it all together all day long that they just crash when they get home, and they're really struggling with their emotional regulation, their executive functioning, their inattention, but they're not hyperactive. That doesn't mean that there isn't something that we can do. Now, when I talk about ADHD, I'm not one to just like jump straight to meds. And especially if it's kind of this how much interference is this causing? What are the other things that we can do? I want to really focus on a lot of other things before we jump to medications. And so I want to make sure that their sleep is okay. I want to make sure that they're getting physical activity every day and that we're getting good nutrition on board to help them to thrive when it comes to their brain. I also typically will do just some basic lab tests to make sure that their brain has the building blocks that it needs. So things like iron, things like vitamin D, copper and zinc play a role in inattention and hyperactivity and focus. And so it's, less than $100 worth of lab testing that we typically will do to make sure that there isn't something that we're missing. And then when it comes to supplementing, I'm not one that just like puts everybody on a supplement like, hey, take this. It's, use this and this and this, because what inevitably happens is an Instagram influencer or TikTok or somebody sells them on this vitamin is going to completely change their lives. And you give it a week and it hasn't completely changed their lives. And then it sits on the shelf for 6 months because you think, well, it didn't work. If instead we know that their vitamin D level was low, or we know that their ferritin level was low, which interferes with dopamine synthesis and transport and good sleep. If we know those things are low, we're going to be much more likely to give it a go and say, okay, it's going to take 8 to 12 weeks before we start to notice a difference. And we're okay with that. And we know that this level shows us that there was something off and we can do something about it. So making sure that the brain has the raw materials. You're already putting, those executive functioning scaffolds at home, the things that they mentioned, things like pictures and lists and timers are great to offload those from the brain of trying to remember, like, what am I supposed to do now? And what does my morning routine look like? And how am I going to get my, homework done and all of those sorts of things. Getting those at school is critical. And talking with the teacher and saying, hey, I know that she's not causing a lot of trouble. I know that you're not flagging her as being really disruptive, but we are having some issues with inattention. And how can we put some practices in a place to help focus? Maybe it's fidgets, maybe it's shorter instructions, maybe it's longer testing time, maybe it's preferential seating. There's loads of different things that we can do. If we've done all of that and we are still struggling from an emotional regulation standpoint, from an executive functioning standpoint, then sometimes we say, okay, you might not meet the DSM criteria, but this is the real world, and we can take the what we know and make a plan. What happens when we use a medication like a stimulant, which is what works best by and far for inattention, is it unburdens them from having to hold all those things together. And so then their emotional regulation and their executive functioning improves simply because we're not working so hard to hold it all together. And so I do think that a lot of times we'll talk through this, we'll come up with a plan, we'll try some things, and then we'll decide, okay, we've tried those things. How's everything going? Well, we're still really struggling with this and this. Well, let's do a trial of medication and see what happens. This isn't a lifelong sentence. It may help both at school and at home. And even if at school we're not having a lot of issues, if we can unburden ourselves from having to hold all that together all day long, it can make a huge difference for their confidence, for their success in school, for friendships, for connection, for all the different things that we're trying to aim for. And then that relieves that burden on them so that at home they have more of those skills on board and they have more spoons available. They have more bandwidth for all those sorts of things. And we see a huge improvement I think that the last thing that I'll say is children deserve to have those brain needs met. And I don't think it's fair to say, well, they don't meet these criteria and they're thriving, even though they're just kind of holding it all together all day long. There's so much that we can do to help when it comes to those children. One other thing that I forgot to mention above too is omega-3s. Omega-3s are huge for children with ADHD. There are some tests we can do, but I will typically say, let's save the blood and just start them on omega-3 because we know that omega-3s are one of the best nutritional interventions that we can do. So typically that looks like just a little omega-3 supplementation. You can sure get it from smoked salmon and other things in your diet, but for a lot of kids, it's hard to get enough omega-3s. And so a daily omega-3 is a great way to make sure that they're getting what they need brain-wise to fuel their brain processes. So hopefully this has been helpful. I would talk with your teacher, I would talk with your pediatrician and come up with a plan for noticing what's going on and how can we address it to relieve that burden that they're holding on to, whether or not they meet a specific criteria or whether or not their scores are good enough or starting to fail when it finally comes to drawing attention. Hopefully this has been helpful. If you have questions, I love to answer them. Go to dearparents.substack.com, find the little chat window. There's Ask Me Anything button. Check it out and keep up the good work.